I'm not a lawyer, but if you've been trying to figure out how or if the prosecution has actually proven their case against Diddy, well, they used their closing argument to try and pull it all together. So let me walk you through how the government says they've proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Diddy is guilty as charged. And before y'all yell at me, this video is all about the government's closing. Come back for part 2 where I'll break down the defense's side, okay? Now, before I dive in, I want to know that the point of a closing argument is to summarize your case and try to convince the jury one last time that the evidence and testimony that's been presented supports your side. The whole point of this is to persuade the jury one last time. And so for the government's closing, they have this theme that Diddy doesn't take no for an answer. They say this whole case exists because Diddy doesn't accept no, and his enterprise, which was made up of his staff and inner circle, existed to make sure that he never had to. They say that members of this enterprise's job was to fulfill Diddy's every desire, boost his power, and to protect his image. Now, a little bit of context, I want to tell you that all crimes are made up of elements. Follow me. So if a prosecutor in California says that you have committed a robbery, they would have to prove the elements of robbery. So they would have to show that you took someone else's property. That's element number 1. They would have to show that you took that property from that person's immediate presence, meaning they were holding this property or the property was right next to them. They would also have to show that you took this property using force or fear. And then finally, they would have to show that you took this person's property and had no intention of giving it back. So those 4 things are the pieces or the elements that together make up the crime of robbery, at least in California. So applying that to this case, the government uses their closing argument to walk through every charge that Diddy is facing and all of the legal elements that are required to prove each of those charges. And then the government explains how they say they've proven each of those elements and why the jurors should be able to vote guilty. Did all of that make sense? I hope so. So starting with count 1, which is the RICO conspiracy charge, the government first explains that this charge is really about punishing people who commit crimes as a part of a group because they say groups are naturally more powerful and more dangerous than individual people. And so according to the government, Diddy was already a powerful person, but with the support from his inner circle and this enterprise, he was made to be even more dangerous and more powerful. And from there, the government breaks down the elements that are necessary to prove the RICO conspiracy charge. The first element, they have to show that at least 2 people agreed to be a part of this enterprise. Number 2, they have to show that the enterprise affected interstate or foreign commerce. And all this really means is that they have to show that someone or something crossed state lines. The third element is that they have to show that the defendant, meaning Diddy, knowingly became a member of this enterprise. And then element number 4 is that they have to show that the defendant knowingly agreed that he or members of this enterprise would commit at least 2 racketeering acts in a 10-year period. And racketeering acts are just crimes. The government says they have proven element number 1, which is that 2 people agreed to participate in the enterprise. According to the government, Diddy is almost always person number 1. And then depending on the day or the crime, person number 2 could be anyone from KK, D-Rock, Fahim, Bonds, or any of the assistants. The government says anytime an assistant was asked to buy narcotics and they actually bought those narcotics, that was them agreeing to commit a crime and be a part of this enterprise. They also say when D-Rock saw Suge Knight at Mel's Drive-In and then rushed home to tell Diddy, and then they all grabbed weapons and drove back to the Mel's Drive-In, the government says that at that moment, D-Rock was agreeing to participate in the enterprise. And then in regards to KK, they say she was agreeing to participate in the enterprise anytime she instructed people on what to do for Diddy. And the government points out that the law doesn't require that any of these people enjoyed what they were doing or wanted to do what they were doing. The law only requires that these people actually participated in the activities, and that alone proves they joined in the agreement. Okay, moving on to element number 2 for the RICO conspiracy, and that again is affecting interstate commerce. And to this, the government says anytime they were able to show flight receipts or hotel reservations or text messages of Cassie or Jane or others being flown to a different state, or when they showed evidence that narcotics were being moved across state lines, the government says that all of this meets this particular element. And then element number 3, which is Diddy willingly becoming a member of the enterprise, the government says that this element was met because the only reason this enterprise existed is because of Diddy. They say he created it, he led it, and even when assistants or security guards or other members of the enterprise were in and out, the person at the center remained to be Diddy. And then the fourth element required to prove a RICO conspiracy is that the government has to show that Diddy and or members of this enterprise committed at least 2 racketeering activities. Now, before I dive into this element, I need to make a correction to a video I made a couple days ago. In that video, I said that the government removed arson and kidnapping from the racketeering activities, but they actually didn't. What they removed was attempted arson and attempted kidnapping, but they kept actual arson and actual kidnapping. So what this all means is that the jury no longer needs to decide if Diddy and his enterprise attempted to commit arson or attempted to commit kidnapping. They only now have to decide if Diddy and his enterprise actually committed arson and actually committed kidnapping. Hopefully that makes sense. And so in regards to this fourth element, which is the government proving Diddy and his enterprise committed 2 racketeering activities, the government says they have proven Diddy and his enterprise committed a number of racketeering activities. For example, they say when Jane testified that she picked up packages full of narcotics and flew them to Diddy on 2 occasions, and then the government also showed text messages of KK telling Jane where exactly to pick up those packages. The government says that all of this could satisfy the 2 racketeering activities that Diddy and his enterprise committed. And so they say if the jurors only believe that these 2 instances happened, that Jane flew these packages to Diddy twice, that could be enough to satisfy this fourth element. But they don't stop there. They also say that when Diddy's former assistant, Brendan Paul, testified that Diddy once made him try some narcotics to see if they were good, this also could satisfy one of the 2 racketeering acts necessary for element number 4. They say that that was an instance of narcotic distribution, and that distribution does not require the involvement of buying and selling narcotics, and it doesn't even have to involve a large amount of narcotics. As long as narcotics are delivered or passed or handed over to someone else, that alone is distribution. And again, the government doesn't stop there. They say they have proven other types of racketeering activities that Diddy and his enterprise committed. And they include the instance in which Cassie said she had been beaten up by Diddy in a car, and because her injuries were so bad, he hid her away in a hotel until she was all healed up. Well, according to the government, this instance qualifies as kidnapping because Cassie didn't want to go to the hotel, but he made her, and then he had security monitoring her to make sure she didn't leave. And to support this story, the government highlights that Diddy's former assistant, David James, testified on the stand about this incident, saying that he remembers bringing Cassie food to that hotel, and he found it odd that when he knocked, Diddy's security guards answered the door. The other kidnapping instances, they say, were of Capricorn Clark being kidnapped in New York as well as LA. And the government says if jurors believe any 2 of these instances, even if it's one of the narcotic distribution stories and then one of these kidnapping stories, those 2 together could satisfy this fourth element. And then they go on to arson, which they say is another form of racketeering activities that Diddy and his enterprise participated in. And according to the government, the only question is whether the defendant or his co-conspirators were responsible for the arson. And they say, of course, the defendant was behind this. The government argues that Diddy didn't light the match himself because he also doesn't even buy his own soup. But they say he directed the arson, and that's evident because he told Cassie in text messages that he was going to blow up Kid Cudi's car and that he would have it done when he was out of the country. And then next they talk about the bribery allegation, and of course that has to do with the Intercontinental Hotel incident. And according to the government, offering a bribe to someone who witnessed or knows facts related to a crime with the purpose of influencing that person's testimony or the information they may give is considered bribery. So they say that Diddy's exchange of money for this tape was him trying to buy silence, which is a form of influencing testimony. They note that Diddy tried to give the first security guard a stack of cash when he came up to the hotel room, but that security guard declined it. And then they say when he later gave Eddie $100,000 and made him sign an NDA, that again was him trying to buy silence. And they say the reason Diddy didn't want this tape to get out was more than just bad publicity. They say it's because Diddy knew what he did and what was on that tape was a crime. According to the government, Diddy didn't want police to catch wind of what happened, and that's why he told Eddie Garcia not to make any big purchases with the $100,000 because they say he didn't want to draw any attention and have the police take notice. They also say the reason Diddy texted Cassie after the incident that the cops were there and that he was getting arrested is because he knew that what he did was a crime and that it was realistic to assume that the police could get involved. And so again, they say that was his motive for the bribery. All right, so that's the wrap up on the RICO conspiracy, on the elements required to prove RICO conspiracy, and how the government says that they've proven each of the elements. And from there, they start talking about trafficking. So to prove trafficking, the government has to show that number one, Diddy recruited, enticed, transported, harbored, and maintained the women involved. That he, two, knew or didn't care that force, threats of force, fraud, or coercion, or any combination of those things, were used to get these women to engage in these acts. Now, in regards to element number one, the government says Diddy persuading Jane and Cassie to have FOs and hotel nights qualifies as him recruiting and enticing them, and then him paying for the hotel rooms qualifies as him harboring and maintaining the women, and then him paying for them to be flown to different cities qualifies as him transporting them. So according to them, element number one is satisfied. Moving on to element number two, the government stresses trafficking doesn't require that the women involved actually say no. According to them, if Diddy used threats, violence, narcotics, or coercion to get the women to say yes, that's trafficking. The government also points out that they are not saying every FO and every hotel night was trafficking. According to them, the jury only has to believe that in at least one instance of a hotel night or an FO, that Diddy used force, threats, fraud, or coercion to get the women to engage in the acts, and that alone would be enough for a conviction on this charge. And specifically in terms of coercion, the government says that Diddy's decision to pay Jane's rent was a way for him to coerce her. And just so we're on the same page, in layman's terms, coercion is basically getting someone to agree to do something because they are afraid of what will happen if they don't agree. It's the illusion of giving someone an option when the truth is they don't really feel like they have an option. And so to illustrate this point, the government references a time where Jane expressed she wasn't excited about having a hotel night, and then in response to that, Diddy tells her, quote, "Well, get over it, please. Look at the roof over your head and that pretty smile." And then in another example that the government references, they show a text where Jane tells Diddy, quote, "You're not having your way, so you immediately threaten me with rent. I'm tired of the rent threats. I hate living like this. I hate living in fear." Which again, the government says shows that Diddy would threaten Jane about her rent in an effort to get her to agree to do what he wanted. And from there, the government points out the specific instances in which they say Jane and Cassie were trafficked by Diddy. Starting with Jane, they say that Diddy trafficked her through fraud during her September 2023 trip to New York. And in this instance, the government says while Diddy was texting Jane, promising her dinner and a shopping trip and no hotel nights, he was also texting an escort named Paul to set up a hotel night. They go on to say that once Diddy realized Paul wasn't available, he then began texting the owner of the escort site that they used, and it wasn't until Jane was mid-air on her flight that he revealed to her that he had a surprise, and that surprise was a hotel night. And again, prosecutors remind the jurors that if they believe this New York story and this story alone, that would be enough for them to convict him of trafficking Jane. And then the next instance they give is of the sobriety party from October of 2023. And they say that this was trafficking because it was after Jane texted Diddy, quote, "I don't want to be mistreated. I'm not an animal. I need a break." And then Diddy responded to her saying that the two of them should spend the day together without any strangers. But after Jane was still resistant to hanging out with him, Diddy started texting her that he was going to come over to their house and repeatedly asking her if she was going to let him in their house. The government says that Jane continued to be resistant and not wanting to hang out with him, and so then Diddy tried a new tactic, which was to tell her that he was sick. And shortly after this message, Jane replies to him, within a day of these messages, the sobriety party was being planned, and all of this together, according to the government, was done by coercion. And then the final instance is from Jane's house in June of 2024, but I'm not going to go into that story because we all know what happened. Okay, so turning to Cassie and the instances in which the government says that Diddy trafficked Cassie, the first one they highlight is of the Intercontinental Hotel incident, which I won't go over. And then the second one is from an FO that happened in Cassie's apartment in 2013. And then the third instance is from an FO that happened after the Cannes Film Festival in 2012. Now, context for the 2013 incident, the government says that an escort named Daniel was being used for an FO, and in between sessions, while Cassie was laying on the floor, Diddy told her to come to the bedroom, but Cassie said she needed a minute. Daniel, the entertainer, testified on the stand that before Cassie got up to go to the bedroom, Diddy threw a bottle towards her, it hit the wall, and then he dragged her by her hair into the bedroom. Daniel testified that he didn't see what took place in the bedroom, but he heard what sounded like slapping, and when that was all over, Diddy and Cassie came out of the bedroom, and Diddy asked if the two of them were ready to continue. And so, according to the government, this is an example of Diddy trafficking Cassie. All right, on to the final charges that Diddy is facing, and that is for transportation to engage in play for pay. And this charge doesn't require force, fraud, or coercion. The elements are just that Diddy knowingly transported the women, and he doesn't have to like physically transport them. Arranging their transportation also works for this. And then the second element is that Diddy intended for the women to engage in play for pay. And the government says that they've proven this through the testimony from the entertainers, where they said that they were paid, as well as the text messages and different records where they show that payments had been made. Okay, so I didn't hit everything, but I think I hit the big ones and hopefully explained in a way that makes sense how the government is saying that they have proven their case. I'm not saying you have to agree, but I do hope that it made sense. And now that I've laid it out, I want you to tell me if you believe that the government has actually proven their case, or maybe you think technically, yes, they've proven it, but you still don't think he should be found guilty. Or maybe you think, no, they still haven't proven it. Either way, let me know what you think and then come back for part 2 where I go over the defense's closing. It's going to take a couple days though. I don't have the transcript yet. Okay?